Okay, thank you for joining this session. We're going to be going over the first section of chapter 26 in the biology textbook, which is going to be animal evolution and diversity. Specifically, we'll be talking about 26.1, which is about invertebrates and their evolution and diversity. So when we think of animals, the first thing that comes to mind are probably vertebrates. So mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. But the majority of animal species are actually invertebrates. So insects and other creepy crawlies, various worms, crustaceans, shellfish, jellyfish, a lot of weird species that live in the ocean or live in the dirt. So remember that even organisms that don't move on their own for most of their life, things like sponges and corals, they are actually considered animals. So we know very little about the very first animals, and it's because we don't have fossils of them. We don't have any record because they would have been very tiny, they would have had very soft bodies, and so they're not good at leaving fossils when they die. So they would have been very simple animals, similar to sponges, maybe similar to jellyfish, but we don't know very much about them. We do have some fossils from animals that lived 565 to 544 million years ago, and they're found in present-day Ediacara, Australia. So they're called the Ediacaran animals. And they were very different from the organisms seen today. So here's two example fossils, and they're just simple, really rudimentary animals. Now, where things really started to get interesting was during the Cambrian period. So, this was about 540 million years ago, and animals started evolving complex body plans. So, this is where animals started to get specialized cells, tissues, and even organs. They started to show symmetry, segmentation, a difference between the front end and the back end, and appendages. So, appendages are things like legs and antennae that stick off of the body. These characteristics developed in a relatively short period of time, which was 10 to 15 million years, and yielded a great diversity in animal species. And so we call this whole period of evolution the Cambrian Explosion, because it happened really quickly and made really big changes. And what else is important about it is the animals that developed during this Cambrian explosion include all the basic body plans of animals alive today. So animals of that time are ancestors of our existing animal phyla. For example, on the left, we have a fossil of a marella, which was considered an arthropod, and on the right, we have a modern day arthropod, crab. Now, speaking of phyla, we're about to discuss the traits of several animal phyla, and I want to remind you about this big diagram of animal body plans from chapter 25, and that's on page 614. And this is really important for this test. So you don't want to try to memorize this diagram, but you'll need to know where it is and use it to look up this information because you're going to need it for several questions that ask you on the test what phylum an animal is in based on the traits that it gives. So you could use the text that's on pages 626 and 627 in this chapter, but really this diagram has it all in one place. You might also want to look at this cladogram, which is from the page after it, 615, and it helps to show what evolved from what and when certain traits came into play. And you'll just want to realize that the phyla are labeled up here, but they use the same icons as on the previous page. So you'll see here we've got echinoderms and they've got this starfish icon. And so on this one, it doesn't say echinoderms, but we've got the same starfish. So we know that's echinoderms. So before we move on, quick review. When did the complex body plans seen in modern animals first develop? Was it during the Cambrian explosion? Was it only 10 to 15 million years ago? Or was it during the Ediacaran period? A few seconds to think about it. And it was during the Cambrian explosion. So the Cambrian explosion lasted 10 to 15 million years that's how long it took to happen, but it was much longer ago. It was about 540 million years ago. And the Ediacaran was older. Those fossils are very different from today's animals. They have different body plans. And another quick review, which useful thing on page 614 in your textbook? Is it a timeline of the Cambrian explosion? Is it a chart showing animal characteristics? Or is it a practice quiz? And hopefully you remember it is a chart showing characteristics of different types of animals. So again, if a test question gives you some traits and asks what phylum it's in, check this chart. Now we're talking about chapter 26 and the characteristics of these different phyla, but let's review a few of the terms that we're about to talk about. So these are terms from chapter 25 that we're using in chapter 26. So the first ones are body cavities. There's two types of body cavity. You have a coelom, which is completely lined with tissue that came from a mesoderm. So you can see this cavity here that's lined on both sides. A pseudocoelom is only partly lined with tissue from the mesoderm. So you can see it's a cavity here that's only lined on one side. And then if there's no coelom at all, they're acoelomates, and you can see there's just no empty space here. It's just solid. Another set of terms, there's an early stage of embryonic development where it's just basically a hollow ball of cells, and a hole called a blastopore forms in one side of that. And this is actually kind of a big divider of types of animals. So if the blastopore becomes the animal's mouth and the anus develops later, the animal is called a protostome. Most invertebrates are protostomes. If the blastopore becomes the animal's anus and the mouth develops later, the animal is a deuterostome. So a few invertebrates are deuterostomes, and all chordates are deuterostomes. So fun fact, you as a human are a chordate, so you are a deuterostome. So as an embryo, your butthole developed before your mouth. And the last term to review is cephalization. It's just having a head. So in animals without cephalization, things like the starfish and these clams, there's no distinct head on that body. But things with cephalization, you've got this octopus, which definitely has a head here, and this insect, and even this flatworm, it's got these little sensory organs up here, giving it a distinct head. So that's cephalization. Okay, so on page 626 and 627, it describes the major invertebrate phyla. There are others, but we're just going to talk about these because they're kind of the big deal ones. So the simplest one of all is the porifera, which are the sponges. They have all the characteristics required to be animals. They're multicellular, they're heterotrophs, they do not have cell walls, but they're super simple. They have very few specialized cells, they have no true tissues, they have no symmetry, and they're immobile. Slightly more complex are the cnidarians. The C in that word is silent. These are the jellyfish, the coral, and the anemones. So they have tissues, they have radial symmetry, and they can move at one stage of their life. So even coral, anemones, things that we're used to seeing stuck to the ocean floor, they do have a stage of life where they can move around. Now, they don't have any circulatory or waste removal systems. They just rely on things to diffuse throughout their body. Next up, we have nematodes. They're the roundworms. Now, I hate to break this news, but SpongeBob is not accurate on this one. They don't really swarm onto foods and consume entire objects. About half of known species of nematodes are parasites. So many of the worms that can infect dogs and other plants are nematodes. So things such as heartworm and pinworms, whipworms, hookworms, they're all nematodes. Some of those can infect humans. They do have a pseudocoelom and a two-ended digestive tract, and their excretion and circulation are done through the body walls. And there's a picture of an actual nematode. Next, we have flatworms. They're kind of similar, but they are flat. They have no coelom. They do have cephalization, so one end of these worms is the head. Some examples of flatworms are tapeworms and flukes, and this is not a tapeworm, that is a fluke, sorry. Both of those are parasites. And circulation in these is done through diffusion, but there are some specialized cells for excretion. So you notice different things about these are getting more and more developed as we go. And that's going to lead us to annelids. Annelids are earthworms and leeches, and they are much more complex. They have a closed circulatory system with a heart-like structure. They even poop out of an anus, and they have nerve cords with a rudimentary brain. Mollusks are really varied. So mollusks are things like snails and slugs, clams and oysters and mussels and scallops, and then octopi and squids and cuttlefish. So really different things, but they're all mollusks. So some traits that they share, they all have coeloms and they have complex organ systems. They have soft bodies with an inner shell or an outer shell. So on the clams and the snails, you see the outer shell, but some of them have a shell inside. Um, they have sensors to detect vibrations, chemicals, and touch. Most of them have eyes, and they have a foot for moving. Other than that, it's hard to say that anything is common to mollusks because there's such a great variety. Squid and octopi are very complex compared to things like clams and oysters. And that just kind of shows how evolution, still works. So we branched off into mollusks, and mollusks kept evolving into, different types of things. Arthropods are the big one. This includes lots of things: spiders, centipedes, millipedes, insects, crabs, and lobsters. Um, Lots of different things fall under arthropods. Some traits that they all share, though, even though they're really variety of a large amount of animals, they all have bodies divided into segments. They all have a hard outer skeleton called an exoskeleton. So that's the shell on lobsters and crabs and on kind of crunchy bugs. And some of them have it and then have a layer over it so you don't notice it so much. But they all have some sort of shell, exoskeleton. And they all have appendages with joints. So their legs have joints, and they might have antennae that have joints, or claws like a crab that have joints. And this is the phylum with the most known species on Earth. Okay, arthropods are everywhere. And the last one we're talking about is echinoderms, so sea stars, sea urchins, and sand dollars. Um, it's kind of weird because it seems like, wait, these are less complex than arthropods, right? But they actually developed later than other phyla, and they're unique in that they are deuterostomes, like chordates. So remember that whole thing with which side the blastopore develops on. Everything else is not, but these are deuterostomes, and then chordates are kind of the next big phylum to evolve. They're also deuterostomes. Echinoderms have radiosymmetry, mostly in 5 parts. They have a hard inner skeleton with spiny skin over it, and they have a vascular system full of water that helps them to move and breathe and circulate nutrients and wastes. That brings us to the end of this section. You could definitely watch the video of the next section that's going to be posted right after this. And then if you have any questions, don't hesitate to contact an instructor.